Hello. This story is about a little girl whose doting parents gave her everything she wanted. Well, they would do, because this little girl was a princess. And for example, on this little girl's birthday, the queen, her mother, told her she could have anything she wanted, and the princess said, "Oh, anything? Do you promise?" And the queen said, "Yes, I promise, anything you want." So the princess said, "I want a ball made out of gold." And the queen said, "Well, there's no such thing as a ball made out of gold, dear." But the princess said, "A promise is a promise." So the queen went to the jeweller's and she had them make a ball out of beautiful shining gold. And she gave it to the princess for her birthday. The princess loved her golden ball. And every day she'd go down to the palace gardens and throw it and catch it, play games with it and have all sorts of fun. But one day she went a little bit too close to the palace pond, and she was throwing and catching and throwing and catching and throwing and catching, and she dropped it, splash, into the pond. Well, the princess had a good look down into the pond, but the ball had sunk right to the bottom and she couldn't see it anywhere. So she sat down by the side of the pond and started to cry. And while she was sitting there crying like that, a frog plopped up from the pond like this. Plop. And the frog said, "Ribbit, do you want your ball back?" And the princess said, "Oh my gosh, it's a talking frog!" And the frog said, "Yes, but do you want your ball back?" The princess said, "Oh yes, please, please, will you get it for me?" The frog said, "Well, what would you do if I got you your ball back?" And the princess said, "Anything, oh, anything." So the frog said, "Would you be my friend if I went and got your ball back?" And the princess said, "Oh yes, I promise, anything." So the frog jumped into the pond, splash, and after a while he came back with the golden ball. But as soon as the princess saw the golden ball, she snatched it and ran back to the palace without even saying thank you. Well, that evening, they were all sitting at dinner. There was the princess, the king, and the queen, when they heard a funny noise, and the noise went like this: flop, flop, flop. The queen said, "What's that funny noise?" And the princess said, "Nothing." So the queen said, "I think we'd better open the door, don't you?" And she went and opened the door. And there, on the doorstep, was the frog. Well, the queen looked at the princess and the king looked at the princess. And the queen said, "What have you done now?" The princess said, "I have been friends with the morning." The queen said, "I beg your pardon?" And the princess said, "I promised I would be his friend if he got my ball back, but then I wasn't." The queen said, "Well, a promise is a promise." And the princess said, "But how can I be friends with a cold, wet frog?" And the frog, sitting in the doorway, said, "Well, a real friend would invite me in to dinner. After all, a promise is a promise." "Oh, all right," said the princess. And so she picked up the frog, and she sat him next to her at the table, and he ate all the food off her plate like this with his long tongue. At the end of dinner, the princess said to the frog, "Will you go on back to the pond now?" And the frog said, "A real friend would let me stay for a sleepover. After all, a promise is a promise." "Oh, all right," said the princess. And so she picked up the frog, and she took him upstairs with her to her bedroom, where she said, "Here, you can sleep in this nice box." But the frog said, "A real friend would let me have the bed. After all, a promise is a promise." "Oh, all right," said the princess. And so she put the frog down on her pillow. And she went to find herself a sleeping bag so that she could sleep on the floor. But just as she was doing that, something very strange started to happen. The frog, sitting on the pillow, began to grow and grow and grow. And then he grew long legs and long arms, and he lost his green colour, and before the princess knew what was going on, there was a boy standing there. The princess said, "Who are you?" And the boy said, "I'm a prince. See, a wicked witch put a spell on me so that I would always have to be a frog unless somebody was a really good friend to me. So thank you." The princess said, "But I haven't been a really good friend to you. I didn't really like you at all." And the prince said, "But you see, you kept your promises even when you didn't feel like it. So you see, you were a really good friend." Well, after that, the prince and the princess got to know one another, and they became really, really good friends. And they spent lots of every day together. In fact, they'd quite often go down to the palace garden and play with the golden ball, throwing it and catching it, one to the other, although they didn't ever go too close to the pond. And when the prince and the princess grew up, they got married, and they promised to love one another forever and ever. And they did, because after all, a promise is a promise.